This incident is tough for me to talk about. I am a 27-year-old male and was living in New Hampshire at the time, in an extremely safe town. I lived alone with my dog Toby during this time and worked 6 a.m. to 3 p.m. Sharing a duplex was new to me and quite different, especially when your neighbors were very odd. It was a lady in her 60s and a younger man in his 30s. I believed they were mother and son. Because they wouldn't speak to me, I actually had no clue. I tried making small talk, but neither of them said a word. The mother looked beat down with gray hair, and she wore the same blue nightgown every time I saw her. I would see the son smoking outside wearing the same white wife beater since I moved in 7 months prior. It was a summer night in July around 11 p.m., and I let Toby out in the backyard. Now, mind you, I share a backyard with these creeps. Toby was running around, and I heard the neighbors slide the door open. I saw the younger man in his wife beater walk out onto the deck, and he gave me a death stare. My heart dropped, and I began feeling extreme anxiety. I saw him reach in his pocket, and he pulled out a gun. He pointed it at Toby and fired 4 times. I screamed louder than I ever have in my life. The man ran inside and closed the door. I began sprinting towards Toby, but he fled into the woods. I immediately called 911 and told them what happened. The police arrived in 5 minutes and surrounded our duplex. They placed me in a police car and asked me to recount what happened. My dog Toby never barked and was the most behaved puppy ever, so he had no excuse to shoot him. The cops were outside about 15 minutes until they heard 3 gunshots. They rushed inside and found the mother and son deceased, both by bullet wounds. Come to find later, the son had shot his mother twice and committed suicide with a single shot to the head. Later that night, Toby came back and was shot in his back leg. After a couple surgeries, he came back brand new. This was the most horrific thing I have ever witnessed. So, I'm a female, and this happened when I was around 12. First, some backstory. I had this neighbor that lived down the street from me. For a couple months, he lived with his dad because he couldn't afford his own place. No problem. Yet. Until he started staring, peeking, and looking into windows of houses. The horrifying part is no one knew why. Probably to look at naked women, but he had been caught many times. The police were called on him multiple times, and he was arrested on a handful of occasions for smaller problems. Well, while this was going on, rumors spread that he was lurking around the neighborhood, so parents became hesitant to let their kids outside to play. Now, one day, I met him face to face. I was walking home from my grandparents' house, who lived just a short walking distance away, with my younger brother, who was 10. We were just walking and talking about how the day was going. So we were walking home, and it was close to a 5-minute walk back to our house. Once we finally turned the corner to our small cul-de-sac, we see the man's car drive by. The whole neighborhood was on watch for him. I whispered to my brother, "That's," he says. "No way, really?" And him being the smart, invincible 10-year-old he was, he yells, "Yo!" to his moving car with the windows down. Not thinking he really heard us, I gave him a stern smack in the head and told him to keep walking. Meanwhile, the man turns his car around and starts to follow us. I finally notice in disbelief and scream, "Run!" And we run into my mother's arms. She was waiting for us in the garage, not noticing what happened. The man did a loop with his car into the cul-de-sac and left going the way he came. He now knew where we lived. That night, we all huddled, nervous that he was lurking around the home. He never came back, as far as we know. 2 weeks later, he was arrested for showing his male parts to a woman in Walmart. He was put in jail for about a year and is now back in our neighborhood, selling drugs and so on. Many rumors have spread that he lured many underage girls to his house, but no one knows if that's true or not. So that's where I sit today, wondering, always wondering what happened to him, and always looking over my shoulder. So this happened in 2013. This kid named Ricky moved in next door to me, and he was around 12. For lack of a better term, this kid was pretty much a pussy. I remember one time he fell on his skateboard and he didn't land hard at all and was crying his little heart out in my driveway, and he was like 16 at the time. So fast forward to when this kid is like 18. By then, I'm selling coke and molly pretty heavily, and he's one of my best customers. By now, he's hanging with some pretty shady people, which my parents obviously aren't fans of. My parents also didn't know I was ever selling anything, because I was pretty good at keeping it under wraps. Ricky was clearly a follower. He went from the skater emo type to some wannabe thug, which he just wasn't built for. So my parents go on vacation to the Outer Banks of North Carolina every year for 2 weeks, and they always ask if I'll come stay at their house while they're gone. I was excited about this because their house is much better than the shitty little one-bedroom apartment I had at the time. So everything was going fine at the house. I had my on and off again girlfriend over all the time, and there was quite a bit of drugs and alcohol going on. I was far from a saint back then. I'll never forget it. It was a Thursday night. My girl had left a few hours ago. I should say, earlier that day, Ricky had seen me outside of my parents' house and had asked me for a front. I told him no, considering I never fronted anyone, and in all honesty, I had been using too much of my own shit, so I couldn't afford to do so anyway. He didn't like that very much, and we got in an argument, and I pretty much punked him in front of all his little friends. So, by now, it's 2 in the morning, and I'm obviously nowhere near tired because of all the coke and molly I had been doing. I'm sitting in the dark watching Netflix in this den side living room my parents had in the downstairs, which has a window going outside, which I had open. I had paused the TV and was on my phone texting and on Facebook when I hear something. It's the screen of my window slowly being slid up. I know the sound. I had snuck in and out of this house numerous times growing up. So I slowly get up and watch the window. I clearly see the screen moving very slowly up through the curtains. So I walk up to the window, and as soon as I move the curtain, at least 3 or 4 people scatter. I run out front, but by the time I get out there, they are booking it down the street. I knew it was that Ricky kid and his friends. I didn't see them, but I knew it was those shitheads. I didn't call the cops or anything, because I wasn't exactly living on the right side of the law. So I just went back inside and locked everything up, and the rest of the week went by smoothly. I never told my parents about it, and I also never saw Ricky again. I had called him a few times, which he never answered, which was all the more reason to know it was him, and he knew that I knew. So a month after the incident, I'm watching the news, and Ricky is on it for murder, which blows my mind. Him and 3 of his friends went out of town and broke into some old couple's home, beat them, tied them up, and stabbed them. Then they burnt the house down after robbing it. They all ended up telling on each other, and Ricky got sentenced to 35 years for testifying against his co-defendants. It makes me wonder if I was asleep when they got in, what could have happened. There's a link to the news article related to this story in the description. I literally just remembered this guy, so I am quickly writing it down here so I don't forget. For a little background, this happened in Florida between 2004 and 2006. Yeah, I'm an early 2000s kid. So I'm a female and was around 5 to 7 years old at the time. My older sister was just a few years older than me. I am a French American and grew up overseas, so visiting my grandparents in America had always been an interesting experience. The neighbor was a very old, skinny man from what I can remember, and he had a wife. We never really saw the wife much, besides her trimming the hedges and occasionally staring at my sister and I while we ran around the backyard. To make sense for the following events, my grandparents used to live in the neighbor's house, so when my grandparents moved, they just went one house over. I remember having had left a few toys in that old house, and I always wanted to go over there in my own time to try and get them back. This never happened. I remember on several accounts this old man would try and coax my older sister and I into his house. Sometimes he would try this with us both at once, and other times he would try to get us individually to enter his house. I was just a little kid at the time, but I do remember certain things in detail. There was this one encounter with our neighbor that I'll never forget. One time I was playing out in the backyard looking for lizards and whatnot when I saw the neighbor waving at me. I remember watching him for a bit before trotting over to him. He seemed to be signaling for me to come into his garage. Right before I did so, my older sister appeared behind me and grabbed my hand. She told me off for almost going onto our neighbor's property. When I told her what happened, I remember she looked over at him. The old man began to say things like,
"Your dog is in my garage. She wandered in here. Come get your dog. I'll even give you two some candy,"
and stuff like that. After a few minutes of this, I had grown kind of bored and sat down on the grass. I remember my older sister leaning down a bit to speak in my ear, and she said something like, "When I say so, we run. Got it?" I just nodded in return, wondering why we would need to run. As my older sister stared the man down, he soon began to start walking out of his garage. The neighbor began to talk about Candy, our dog, and other things while he began to approach us. I remember looking at him in confusion as the man began to approach us. Seeing this, my sister whispered, "Now!" to me as we both began to book it back to the house, with the man screaming at us to come back. Once we ran inside, my older sister told my parents what happened, and they confirmed we should never talk to the man ever again. Oh, and by the way, our dog was in the house the entire time. She was fine. At the time, I just thought it was a weird encounter and tossed it aside. Several times after that, I remember the neighbor trying to get me to follow him inside when I had gone looking for golf balls and had wandered too close to his house. This always ended in me tempting death and waiting till he was a few seconds away from grabbing me before I darted back to the house. Either that or my older sister would come rescue me. When I was around 9 years old, the old man died. I don't really remember why, but I think it was something to do with his heart. To be honest, at the time, I didn't care at all. I was happy he was gone, and so was my older sister. Finally, we wouldn't get creeped out anymore. After his death, his son came and got his wife, and they moved out. Now that I think about it, this was very creepy, but at the time, I didn't think about it much, I guess. What I wonder about now is why did he want my older sister and I to come into his house and garage? Why did he lie to us about the dog? What was he planning to do with us? I live in Vermont now, but I'm originally from Massachusetts. After completing school, I moved up here. I found a place for cheap on Craigslist and came up to check it out and decided to move in. The landlord seemed okay. He was a short 60-year-old white guy, down to earth, honest about the condition of the place, and nice enough. He would hit on me every now and then, but myself, coming from a very rough upbringing, I just shook it off and decided I'd keep my distance from him and keep our meetings strictly business. Let's call the landlord Paul. So Paul lives downstairs and I live upstairs, now along with 4 other people who also rent from him. Months go by and everything seems normal. The house is tiny and in bad shape, but I figure it's my first apartment. What do I expect on a student's salary? The 3rd month comes around, and I invite my then-girlfriend over. It's 7 a.m. on a Saturday. We're laying in bed sleeping and snuggling. Then all of a sudden the silence is shattered by Paul, yelling in the hallway, drunk as a skunk.
"I don't care if you're a pussy eater or a cocksucker. Don't cook and then walk away. Don't cook and then walk away."
Paul goes on to elaborate as best as he can that someone had left the stove on and he was afraid a fire would start. My girlfriend looks at me horrified as Paul continues in the background.
"I don't care if you're a pussy eater."
My girlfriend and I look at each other scared and horrified. This had never happened before, and by the banging he was making, we thought he might try to break in or something. Paul then finishes,
"Or a cocksucker. You don't cook. Burn the fucking house down."
Needless to say, she didn't really want to come up and visit very much after we learned what kind of drunk Paul is. An angry one. 3 months later, it's 9 a.m., this time on a Sunday. It's just me this time, and I'm sleeping in bed when again from the hallway, it's Paul, and he's drunk again.
"Whoever, whatever, took a shit in my house and didn't flush, go clean up your shit. You're going to come into my house, take a shit, then not flush the toilet in my house."
So apparently one of my neighbors took a dump while drunk or half asleep or something and clogged the toilet. All I know is what I heard from Paul in the hallway. I should note that when he does this, he often bangs on people's doors at all hours. Sometimes this happens in the middle of the night, but I am always too tired to remember those. And sometimes he even breaks into people's rooms and harasses them. One of my neighbors has a sign on her door that was written just for him. I'll include a picture. And my door I actually reinforced so no one can just beat it down. This isn't even the last time this happened. This guy lives for this, I swear. October 2018. Paul must have gotten so drunk he thought it was Christmas, or he fell asleep drunk watching Scrooge because, sure enough, 2 a.m. rolls around. I was actually up at this time, prepping to start a night shift job in town. I am sitting at my desk working when I start to hear chains rattling. Then I hear banging. I immediately get up and head over to the door to see what the hell is going on, but then the yelling starts. And once I hear it's Paul, I immediately freeze, turn back around, and head back to my desk. This wasn't new at this point, so I just dimmed the lights, kept quiet, and listened. We had been dealing with someone in the house stealing from others lately, to the extent of Paul looking at security cameras to buy. He also left nasty notes littered with curse words addressed to this random thief all around the house. Paul doesn't write notes, though. We know this. No. Paul hits the beer fridge. Then he hits the walls. This time with a chain.
Thief in my house? 4 fucking rules. I gave you 4 fucking rules to follow. Pay me, don't stink, don't bring 5-0 here, and don't touch what ain't yours. 4 fucking rules.
Those were the 4 house rules he puts in his Craigslist ad, and he's tearing up his own hallway with a chain at this point.
You think I give a fuck about this house? I don't give a fuck about this house. I'll go sleep in a tent, tear this fucking house down and sell the land. I'll go live out of my garage.
He ranted on and on for what seemed like forever. Then he went downstairs and started banging down there. For the record, we never found the thief, and stuff still goes missing. As comical as Paul's antics are, they are legit frightening the first few times you deal with this. As I told my ex, he's harmless. He's crazy as shit, but harmless. For most of my childhood, my family and I lived 1 house away from a pedophile. For the sake of this story, I'll call him Mr. Stan. Our old neighborhood started at the top of a hill and went down to a small lake, where the road turned right and branched off into a cul-de-sac and another residential road. Mr. Stan's house was at the top of the hill, and ours was in the middle. Mr. Stan lived in the neighborhood long before we moved in. It's hard for me to remember any vivid details about him, as I was very young at the time, but what I do remember is that every time he saw us, his face would scrunch up as if he smelled something terrible. There was 1 house between his place and ours, something I am very grateful for. I don't know what life would have been like if we had to live right next to him. Right from when we were little, my parents were very strict about walking past Mr. Stan's house. They told us that Mr. Stan was sick in the head, and if he ever asked us to come into his house, that we were never, ever allowed to do it by ourselves. For years, no one told us exactly why Mr. Stan was bad, but we didn't need details. We just knew to avoid him. The look he gave us whenever he was working on his car or planting flowers in his garden was enough. When my sister and I would walk up the hill to school, we would cross the street when we got to his place, just to be safe. Like I said, I don't remember very much about Mr. Stan, and his twisted story begins long before I was even born. For this, I turned to my mom to fill in the details. My mom said that before we ever moved into the cul-de-sac, around the late 70s, early 80s, Mr. Stan already had the reputation of being a heavy drinker. He would get drunk and go over to the house of the family right across the street from us and do terrible things to the daughter while she was babysitting. The daughter tried to tell her mother about it, but since she was a rebellious child, her mother didn't believe her. Her family and Mr. Stan's family were actually good friends. Mr. Stan worked as a corrections officer, and soon accusations surfaced that Mr. Stan and another officer regularly molested their co-workers' kids. Mr. Stan was able to avoid conviction by ratting out the other officer, but in the process, he lost his job. As far as I know, he never really worked after that. Mr. Stan had 2 daughters of his own, and while the older one claimed she was molested and suffered from mental problems as a result, the younger one said she was never mistreated in any way and grew up to be a very positive person. Mr. Stan's wife stood by her husband and claimed he was innocent throughout the whole ordeal. Ironically, the older daughter's emotional instability resulted in her children going to live with Grandpa. More on that in a moment. When my family moved into our house in the cul-de-sac, our next-door neighbor, a kind but nosy old man, told my dad to keep my sister and I away from Mr. Stan. He told my parents the gossip and Mr. Stan's history with children, which, understandably, horrified them both. As a result, my mom and dad were very wary of him from the start. Mr. Stan was cordial enough. He would wave hello to my family and all that neighborly stuff. According to Mom, he even offered to babysit my little sister and I, which my parents politely but empathetically declined. Then, sometime around 2002, my dad was going to work when he came across a neighborhood kid, let's call her Lana, on her way up the street. My dad is a chatty person, so he asked Lana what she was up to. Lana told him she was going to Mr. Stan's house to give him a back rub. Dad knew that something was off, so he told Lana's parents. To his surprise, they weren't alarmed at all, and said that sort of thing happened all the time. According to my mom, when Lana was older, Dad asked her if Mr. Stan ever acted inappropriately towards her during those visits, and her answer was definitely. When my sister was in kindergarten and I was in grade 3, Mr. Stan's grandkids came to live with him and his wife for reasons I mentioned earlier. My parents couldn't believe this was allowed by anyone, especially considering the allegations and neighborhood gossip around Mr. Stan. His granddaughter was in the same kindergarten class as my sister, and his grandson was about my age. Mom told me that it was so disturbing to see the sweet little granddaughter at school every day and know what was probably going on behind closed doors. My parents have always had strong morals, particularly my dad. They would often talk about what they should do. They wanted to report Mr. Stan to the authorities before any harm could come to his grandchildren. Mom and Dad knew that if they reported Mr. Stan, they would be putting themselves at risk, and the rest of the neighborhood was no help. Mom said it was as if they were all hiding under rocks and turning a blind eye to what was happening. In the end, my parents' strong morality won out, and they decided, with the risk of being exposed as whistleblowers, to report Mr. Stan to the principal at my elementary school. The principal, in turn, called the ministry, who sent people to Mr. Stan's house for home visits and investigations. In the end, it was decided that the grandchildren would be removed from Mr. Stan's house. Mom isn't sure how it happened, but somehow it was leaked that my parents were the ones who reported Mr. Stan as a child molester. She thinks Lana's family may have had a hand in it, and, as Mom put it, that's when the real fun began. Mr. Stan was no longer friendly towards my family. No more waves, no more chit-chat. Instead, he would target my mom with his car if she was walking down the road alone, or scream obscenities at my dad as he went to work. A few times he crossed the center line to scare us if we passed each other while driving. He told my dad that he ruined his life and he was a horrible person. Thinking about that now really boils my blood because my dad is one of the kindest and most considerate men I know. Mom was miserable and wanted to move, but Dad, as unshakable as he is, said he wasn't in a hurry. Mom told me it took 3 years of house hunting before she finally convinced Dad it was time to go. Only after all of this, when we begun living in our beautiful new home out in the country, did I finally start to uncover the details to this story, but sadly, it doesn't end there. After we moved out of the cul-de-sac, Lana and the other girls who were now grown up came forward to report Mr. Stan and what he had done. He was hauled into court for a second time, and this time there was no one he could rat on to save himself. The testimony against him was building up. My parents followed the trial in the newspaper. They wanted to see him put away for all the terrible things he'd done. I have no memory of the proceedings, of course, and nobody wanted to explain it to me. I don't blame them. Mr. Stan was not only a former corrections officer, but now he was also a convicted pedophile. He knew he would not last long if he went to prison. So, on a quiet morning 1 week before his sentencing, Mr. Stan took a hunting rifle and shot himself. The folks who moved into Lana's house after her family left were walking their kids to school when they heard the shot. Mom tells me the image of that scene haunts her to this day. I think she imagines what it would have been like if it were her walking my sister and I to school in place of that other family. Or maybe she was disturbed to learn that Mr. Stan had a gun. I know it sounds harsh, but I'm glad he's gone. He can never hurt another child again. My memories of this whole ordeal are far less interesting than the actual event, but one thing I do remember very clearly is being afraid of Mr. Stan's house. I knew it was dangerous. In my memory, it was painted black with white stucco. The car park and stairs to the front door were all underneath the wood roof, which cast the entire front of the house into shadow. To me, it was a monster house, though I didn't know why at the time. My sister and I only ever went to Mr. Stan's front door once. It was Halloween, and my parents decided it was okay for us to trick-or-treat at his house, since they would be standing at the bottom of the stairs. I was actually very reluctant to go, and my parents had to encourage me that it was okay. Mr. Stan's house was the only one that didn't need Halloween decorations to be scary. So my sister and I cautiously climbed the stairs and rang the doorbell. Mr. Stan's wife opened the door. She was kind to us and gave us candy, and I remember being surprised that Mr. Stan's wife was so nice. But what I remember most was that I wanted to see inside the forbidden house. For some reason, this has still stuck with me. I looked behind Mrs. Stan, and there was Mr. Stan in a wife-beater top, beer belly and all, sitting in an armchair watching TV. It was dim in the living room except for a lamp and the glow of the TV. Mr. Stan didn't look at us. For years I wondered if that was what bad men looked like. When I think about this story now, 11 years later, it really hits me how dark my neighborhood was under the surface. It's quite disturbing to me because my childhood was actually quite happy. I was too young to notice anything wrong. I couldn't sense the tension that my parents lived with every day. I didn't know how much potential danger my sister and I were in. All I knew was that it was a beautiful day to play with my marbles and go to the lake. But now that I come to think of it, Mr. Stan may have been the reason my parents bought a copy of You Can Say No, a picture book that teaches children about safety around bad people. I think my parents handled the situation very well, and I'm so thankful they were attentive and brave during the whole thing. This story could have gone very differently. When I think about our old house on the cul-de-sac, it's usually the happy memories I think of first. Mom tells me that despite all the trouble they went through, neither she nor Dad regret the decisions they made. She left me with one last ominous message. They say that every neighborhood has a pedophile living there. Most of the time, we just don't know it.